For most of their existence, actual plays have been foundationally tied to Dungeons & Dragons. And not just the game, but to the brand itself. The majority of the most popular shows either started out playing D&D or play D&D as their primary system. Acquisitions Incorporated, Critical Role, Dimension 20, Not Another D&D Podcast, Dungeons & Daddies, High Rollers, The Adventure Zone, etc. And not only do they play it, but their branding is often tied directly to D&D as well, or at least to concepts associated with D&D. In addition, they often work directly with Wizards of the Coast and have been since the very beginning of the medium. But change is in the air. The tabletop RPG space is diversifying. Many companies that used to exclusively make D&D products are now making their own games, and the D&D brand is expanding to other forms of media like movies and video games. And it doesn't help that they did break a lot of the goodwill they had with the TTRPG community after the OGL scandal. To me, it feels like there's some kind of separation happening. So what does this mean for actual plays? Has this long-term partnership between the medium and the brand run its course? Or is it about to collapse without the support of Dungeons & Dragons? First, let's rewind a bit and understand the history of this relationship. The actual play medium largely began in the early 2000s with the emergence of podcasts. There were a handful of shows that popped up here and there, but nothing really caught on. Until that is, a partnership between Penny Arcade and Wizards of the Coast birthed a podcast that eventually became what we all know today as Acquisitions Incorporated. This show began explicitly as a promotion for 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. The creators, Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik, pitched the idea to Wizards, and they got the green light. Not only that, but they got Chris Perkins, D&D's story manager at the time, to be their dungeon master, which was a huge boon for the podcast, because being a game master is hard and Chris Perkins is one of the best. It takes so much time to build your world, come up with a story, find maps and music, and come up with fun ways to describe the character's surroundings. And that's why this video is sponsored by Describe. Describe makes a ton of the heavy lifting you need to do as a GM quick and easy. They have professionally pre-written scenes that you can drag and drop into your prep. They have beautiful interactive maps made by professional cartographers, and the maps even have scenes built into them that you can use directly, take inspiration from, or just study to learn how you want to describe things in your game. Most recently, they launched a new service called Opus, which makes finding and using music at your table a cinch. You can build collections, playlists, and sound effect boards for planned encounters, or you can use the roam function to quickly and easily find the right track for when your players inevitably go off the rails. So if you want to save a lot of time and energy while also keeping your games high quality, check out Describe. And if you sign up for a free trial using the code CastleCaster, you'll get an extended 1-month free trial. That's code CastleCaster, or use the link in the description. Thanks to Describe, and now back to the video. Acquisitions Incorporated took off. It became about as popular as a Dungeons & Dragons podcast could be at that time. They had live shows, video series, and became an official D&D sourcebook. While it wasn't the first actual play, I'd argue that Acq Inc. was the foundation for the medium as it exists today. It showed people outside of a very, very specific niche that this kind of show was possible and entertaining. That said, Acq Inc. never really broke out of the Penny Arcade Dungeons & Dragons audiences, at least not to a significant degree. The real explosion in popularity came in 2015 with Critical Role and The Adventure Zone. Critical Role was the first actual play to break into, at least partially, mainstream culture. It was still limited to the nerd version of mainstream culture, but at its height, I had people who had never played an RPG before in their life asking me about Critical Role, so its reach was pretty wide. It also coincided roughly with the beginning of The Adventure Zone. Though Taz did begin a year earlier, they did seem to reach the peak of popularity around the same time. And once again, these popular shows, the most popular shows at the time, were deeply tied to the brand of Dungeons & Dragons. The Adventure Zone began by playing the starter kit's adventure, Lost Mines of Phandelver, and Critical Role actually switched from Pathfinder to D&D for the show. And while the Adventure Zone's interaction with Wizards of the Coast seems relatively limited, Critical Role's was not.
And welcome to tonight's episode of Critical Role, where a bunch of us nerdy-ass voice actors sit around and play Dungeons & Dragons.
Their brand was, and to an extent still is, entirely dependent on Dungeons & Dragons. They dabbled in other systems from time to time, but the vast majority of their shows have been using D&D 5e. DR and WotC are, to this day, at least at the time of recording, deeply intertwined. Critical Role was the first and one of the only third-party companies to have their content hosted on D&D Beyond. The others being Acquisitions Incorporated, Ghostfire Gaming and the Dungeon Dudes, and Minecraft and Rick and Morty, apparently, but those don't feel like they count. They also had Chris Perkins guest on the show multiple times, one of which is still their best guest appearance by far.
Hey, Spurt, how long have you lived down here?
11 days!
11 days?
How long do kobolds live? 11 days!
And for the entirety of their second campaign, Critical Role was sponsored by D&D Beyond.
You click open the webpage, you heard about a Critical Role, and now you're ready to kick some butt in that mine shaft full of no's. It's D&D Beyond.
Which at the time, it was not owned by Wizards of the Coast, but still dependent on the D&D brand. That said, while it was still probably the more powerful of the two in the partnership, Wizards of the Coast owes a lot of their success to Critical Role and actual plays like it. Many people discovered the hobby or better understood it and took interest because of these shows. Since Critical Role's beginnings, a lot of different shows have found audiences. Many were produced independently or even by D&D Beyond or Wizards of the Coast. While not all of them played D&D, it was still the primary cultural influence in the medium's landscape. And then came the OGL scandal. A lot has been said about the OGL scandal, so I'll keep it brief here. In early 2023, Wizards of the Coast announced that they would be making changes to their open gaming license, which for a decade or so had allowed third parties to make and sell content for D&D without fear of being sued or given a cease and desist, so long as they followed the terms, which were pretty lenient. This developed an entire industry around D&D, which benefited a lot of independent creators and Wizards of the Coast. The changes they announced would have made it so the products that the creators would have made would have to be registered with Wizards of the Coast. And if they made above a certain threshold, they had to report their income, and then above another higher threshold of $750,000 a year, they would have to pay a certain percentage in royalties. And there was a huge backlash against this. And Wizards of the Coast walked back the changes and put their SRD in the Creative Commons, ensuring its free use permanently. And this was a good move, but by the time they did this, a lot of damage had been done. And since then, the RPG space has been diversifying. MCDM and Kobold Press announced their own systems. ISO started developing its own open license called the Orc. And most importantly for this discussion, actual players seem less inclined to play D&D. For example, Dimension 20, while still using Dungeons & Dragons, seems to be kind of distancing itself from the brand. One of their more recent seasons, Metropolis, saw Brennan Lee Mulligan running kids on bikes. And while their two most recent seasons, Burroughs End and Fantasy High Junior Year, both use D&D, they have spent time justifying why they chose D&D for these stories.
D&D is very good at having you intersect and interact with change and growth in power.
Fantasy High is not a world of just fantasy plus high school. It's specifically D&D fantasy plus high school. Like, Orgug is not a barbarian theoretically. He has a barbarian teacher. They talk about barbarian classes.
The choice to play D&D feels specific and not just the default. But an even bigger deal was that Critical Role announced it was developing and releasing two of their own systems. One that was designed for short serialized campaigns, that's a system they're currently using for Candela Obscura, and a system called Daggerheart, made for long-term campaigns with a focus on character development. You know, the thing that Critical Role does. Pair that with the fact that Campaign 3 has been working towards some major in-world changes with the Ruidus storyline, and it looks pretty likely that CR will switch to Daggerheart in Campaign 4. And if they do, that could deal a major blow to this long-standing, mutually beneficial relationship that Dungeons & Dragons has had with the actual play medium. So that brings us back to our original question. Is this relationship over? And I think the answer to that is maybe. To be clear, I don't think Dungeons & Dragons is going anywhere. It's still going to be a massive influence on tabletop RPGs, especially with its new rules coming out later this year. But, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but I don't think actual plays need Dungeons & Dragons anymore. That's not to say I never want to see a D&D actual play again. I love D&D, and I love a lot of actual plays that use it. In fact, if a story is best told with D&D, then that's how it should be played. The system that is chosen for an actual play is an integral part of how that story gets told. If Mentopolis used D&D, it would have been a completely different game, and I doubt LA by Night would have worked as well if they were playing Dungeons & Dragons. I still haven't seen it, but I feel like that's right, I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is I don't think the medium of actual plays needs to be so closely tied to D&D anymore. There are plenty of successful non-D&D actual plays, like LA by Night or Friends at the Table, but they've always lived in the shadows of D&D shows like Critical Role, Acquisitions Incorporated, and Dimension 20. But that doesn't have to be the case anymore. I think actual plays have shown enough artistic integrity and popularity that they should have their chance to stand on their own 2 feet. In an article for Polygon, Rowan Zioli interviewed Brennan Lee Mulligan, and the two discussed the current state of actual plays and their future potential. One of the things they discussed in the article was how far actual plays have come as a medium. Years of experimentation have molded this weird combination of improv and gaming into a unique and beautiful style of performance art. One that a lot of folks who have never played an RPG watch and enjoy. I think that has value completely independently, separate from Dungeons & Dragons and even separate from the RPGs that we play at home. Actual plays are a relatively new and underappreciated art form, and the entire medium has, for a long time, been dominated by a single brand. And I think it's time for them to break away, become independent, stand on their own 2 feet. They don't need Dungeons & Dragons anymore. It was a great partnership for a while, but now it's time for them to strike out on their own.